I'm Larry Wexler. I work for the U.S. Department of Education, the Office of Special Education Programs, which you've probably already deduced because I'm the only one in the audience with a tie on. And let me just say, I direct the Research to Practice Division in OSEP, which administers about $270 million in discretionary grants annually. We work very closely with colleagues in IES and appreciate the work that we do together with them. I'm assuming that my being up here has nothing to do with the fact that we just gave Russell and his group about $1.2 million yesterday, and so I know there's no correlation there. But just a couple of things I wanted to say before we do introductions. We did make two award announcements in the last day that I think are germane to this conference. The first, which Russell's involved with, is a model demonstration programs on algebraic reasoning. Polly Maccini is the project officer, and they went to Instructional Resource Group, AIR, and University of Missouri, I believe Erica Lemke. The other one that we did is a little vaguer. I characterize it as a venture capital investment that we're making that is essentially state an engineering problem and put $5 million in the hands of some really smart people to do good things for kids and families. So the formal title is Research and Development Center on Developing Software to Adapt and Customize Instruction in Digital Learning Environments to improve results for kids with disabilities. And this is essentially the result of some other research we've done that basically showed that kids with disabilities are being plopped in front of computers and told, go forth and learn, whether they're at home or in school, and there's really no adaptive instruction. That went to CAST. It will be an open educational resource, and we're extremely excited of the potential for this particular investment. So I was told to make the introductions just a few sentences. I'll adhere to that. So Dr. Mark Tumeo is the Dean of the College of Computing, Engineering, and Construction, and a professor of civil engineering at the University of North Florida. Dr. Tumeo has over 30 years of experience in environmental and consulting and research, and has extensive experience in publications in environmental risk assessment, policy, and regulation. Don Compton is a professor of psychology and education at the Florida State University and director of the Florida Center for Reading Research. He earned a PhD from Northwestern University School of Communication Sciences and Disorders with a specialization in learning disabilities. His research involves modeling individual differences in the development of children's reading skills and the identification and treatment of children with learning disabilities. They'll each chat for about 15 minutes and hopefully time for questions before the conference gets wrapped up. Are you first?
Yep.
Don will go first. Thanks. I'll give you a heads up at 15 minutes. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Don Compton. It's a pleasure to be here. I guess, as Monty Python would say, and now for something completely different. So the title of this talk is Examining the Hypothesized Linkage Between Exceptional Abilities and Dyslexia, Considering the Population and Distributional Issues. March 31st, 2017. Sir Richard Branson announces his intent to open the world's first dyslexia-only sperm bank. Announced on the Virgin website. According to Branson, up until very recently, some sperm banks have rejected donors that have dyslexia. To me, this is absurd when you think that some of the most successful people in the world are dyslexic. Rather than being seen as a weakness, dyslexia should be seen as a strength. Turns out March 31st is very close to April 1st. A brilliant practical joke by Richard Branson. But his sentiments are seen throughout the media. In Malcolm Gladwell's book, David and Goliath, Gladwell spends a chapter arguing whether you should wish dyslexia on your child. We would think you wouldn't. He asks, well, should you? Okay? So Gladwell develops the idea that dyslexia might be a desirable difficulty, a condition that is usually a liability, but can also be seen as the engine for astonishing personal success. And he's impressed by the number of dyslexics who have become entrepreneurs and in other fields of distinction. So he argues that dyslexia and dealing with its consequences play a causal role in their success. Recently, in the Examiner from the International Dyslexia Association, the question was asked, is dyslexia a gift? Okay? If you look at this publication, you see that, one, there's a brain. In the one hemisphere, we have many of proclaimed successful dyslexics who you should recognize, a list of possible strengths that are associated with dyslexia, and then we have this little guy in the corner here with his super dyslexia. He's obviously come out of the phone booth to solve some problem, and dyslexia is his superpower. So this type of argument has shown up in the areas of art, in entertainment, engineering, sporting, politics, creative writing, and business, and of course scientists. So is dyslexia a gift, or perhaps is it a neuromyth? So what is a neuromyth? Neuromyths are misconceptions about brain research and its application to education and learning. You've heard of these, Guinevere, I'm sure. Previous research has shown that these myths may be quite pervasive among educators, but less is known about how these rates kind of compare across various groups, from those who have no education to those who have been trained in education to those who know about neuroscience. So you can actually go to testmybrain.org and see what this survey looks like. It was sent out to a group of people. So basically on this, you read a set of questions and you answer yes or no. Okay, and these are too small for you to see. They're actually too small for me to see. But there's one question here that is somewhat important to us, and it is: a common sign of dyslexia is seeing letters backwards. All you have to do is respond yes or no. So results indicated that a core group of 7 classic neuromyths factored together as a freestanding factor. These items related to learning styles, dyslexia, the Mozart effect, the impact of sugar on attention, right brain, left brain learners, and using 10% of your brain. Okay? So the general public endorsed the greatest number of these neuromyths, 68% of them as being correct. Significantly fewer educators endorse those, and then even fewer people who have high exposure to neuroscience. The 2 most commonly endorsed neuromyths across all groups related to learning styles and dyslexia. Now, Jack, pay attention. Are you back there? So the dyslexia neuromyth, well, I'm just saying because people need to see Jack's presentation, particularly in neuroscience. So the dyslexia neuromyth, a common sign of dyslexia is seeing letters backwards, was endorsed by 76% of the public, okay? 59% of educators, 50% of people with high backgrounds in neuroscience. They obviously have not heard Jack talk, okay? So the question is, dyslexia is a gift. Is this a neuromyth, okay? I'm not here to tell you whether it is or not because I don't really have any data on it, but I want to kind of walk you through how we might want to test this. So if you do, people think of TED Talks as fairly credible talks. If you search for TED Talks, sorry, maybe they're not, but if you search for TED Talks supporting dyslexia as a gift, you get many, many hits, okay? I use these in a class that I teach that's called Dyslexia, the Science, the Media, the Individual. And the media is very powerful at promoting this idea that if you have dyslexia, you also have a gift. We also have the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity, which also does work in this area. We have books that certainly spend many, many pages outlining the gift of dyslexia. Within the academic community, we have some who promote through writing that dyslexics think differently. They have a set of skills that are different. And then we have others who say things like the frequent references in the media to gifted dyslexics, for instance, Albert Einstein, Thomas Edison, Winston Churchill, merely feed this perception, which Elliott and Greg Grenko think is a misrepresentation of the actual population statistics. So how should we think about this scientifically? Well, let's think about it from a population and an individual standpoint. So we know that dyslexia is a phonologically based reading and spelling disorder. We usually define it by the tail end of the distribution of reading and spelling. That's dyslexia. So if we think about creativity, there's all sorts of other things we could think of. Let's just do creativity. Then we can presumably measure creativity on a distribution. And so the idea is that it's being kind of postulated out in the media is that selecting a sample for dyslexia results in a sample that also have high creative ability. Okay? So actually I have this, that should be within the individual. Now if we think about it more from a population standpoint, if you select a group of individuals with dyslexia at the tail end of the reading and spelling distribution, it's just as likely that they could vary like the population does in terms of creativity. So if you select dyslexics, any dyslexic could fall anywhere along this distribution. They could be high, they could be medium, they could be low. So it's all a question of comorbidity, okay? And we've heard a lot about comorbidity. It's the co-occurrence of in this case, a disorder and a gift. So we call that dual exceptionality in the field. So a key issue here is the distinction between exceptionality as it occurs at the individual level versus at the population level, okay? If you believe comorbidity between dyslexia and giftedness is based on the individual, then the co-occurrence will be fairly low, probably at chance, okay? If you believe comorbidity between dyslexia and giftedness is at the population base, then the co-occurrence will be relatively high, well above the rate of chance. In addition, if you believe in population-based comorbidity, then it would seem reasonable that a set of cognitive skills, affective processes, and neural circuits could be discovered that cause this double exceptionality. So let me talk about three models of comorbidity. So the first model is a chance model. Under the chance model, the liability factors are uncorrelated, and comorbidity happens purely by chance, okay? In a correlated liabilities model, under the correlated liabilities model, the liability factors are correlated at some level between 0 and 1, and comorbidity cases reflect the correlation between these liabilities. The key here is, as that correlation increases in the population, the chance of being comorbid goes up, okay? And then the last is a causal model. In the causal model, one disorder causes the other. So this is different than a correlated, it's actually causal, okay? And so results from this liability pattern can be, lost my place, sorry. Causal models differ from the associated liability model in that comorbidity results not from the nature or expression of liability patterns, but rather from a direct influence of one disorder on the other. So here's what a chance model looks like. So in this is skill A, skill B. In order to get at the high end of the distribution on A, it's basically you have to reach a threshold, but it's not dependent on B. To get on B, you have to reach a threshold. It's not dependent on A. And the chance of being comorbid with A and B is chance. So that would look like this. If there's no correlation, then if you select a group of poor readers who are dyslexic, the chance of you being above some threshold for creativity is chance. Okay? In a liabilities model, because the two skills are correlated, if you select dyslexics on the lower end of the distribution, then actually to score above on creativity is less than chance, because the correlation would say that if you're poor on reading, then, and you assume a positive correlation between creativity and reading, you have a better chance of being below that threshold, so it's below chance. In the causal model, if you select a group of dyslexic readers and you assume a causal model between reading, dyslexia and creativity, then actually you have a greater than chance of having creative skills above some threshold. Okay, so I'm going to use a slide that Jack used. It's actually Jack's data that looks at comorbidity between reading disabilities and ADHD. So there are estimates, however you estimate these, that they both occur at, say, 5% of the population. The correlation between reading and attention in the population of elementary age children range from about 0.35 to 0.4. The co-occurrences, depending on whether you select for attention or for reading first, are high, anywhere from 15 to 40%. Moreover, this comorbidity is present in both clinical and community samples, so it indicates no selection bias. So what Jack showed us is if you have a set of children who have reading disability and reading disability plus attention disorder, you see that on important cognitive measures for reading, the two groups are basically right on top of each other for phonological awareness and rapid naming. But what we see is that they differ on attention. Okay? And so you might argue this as a correlated liability. The two are correlated. If you have a reading problem, it's usually manifested through these cognitive correlates, but that based on selecting kids who are low on reading, you also get some kids who, by correlation, are low on attention. Okay? So these models of comorbidity. So which ones actually look like they're plausible? So the chance model seems to be plausible. The correlated liabilities model does not. The causal model is plausible as well. Okay? So in the chance model, that favors comorbidity between dyslexia and giftedness that is individually based. So the co-occurrence will happen at chance. Okay? And in this case, you would not expect to find a common set of cognitive skills, affective processes, and neural circuits that distinguishes this group. In the causal model, you're talking about a population-based model where you think that dyslexia and giftedness is overrepresented in the population. In this model, there should be a set of common cognitive skills, affective processes, and neural circuits that distinguishes this group. So we have to remember that there are methodological threats to accurately estimating comorbidity rates. So comorbidity rates are based on population co-occurrence rates and therefore affected by sampling procedures. So when you derive your sample from hospital records or other enriched sources, you have a higher probability of getting kids who are comorbid. Okay? In addition, how we define dyslexia and creativity can increase or decrease the probability of identifying comorbid individuals. So just as an exercise, if we were to go out and measure from a population standpoint how many people have this dual exceptionality, and we define dyslexia as this, the 16th percentile on the lower end of the range, and creativity is above the 84th percentile, so one standard deviation on both sides, we should estimate about 3% of the population as being dyslexic with exceptional creativity scale. Okay, that's 3% of the general population. So what do we need to do? Well, I think we need population studies examining the comorbidity between dyslexia and other skills of interest, for example, creativity. We need to include careful measurement of important cognitive and affective variables thought to underlie comorbidity. We need to random sample too so that we can make inferences about this co-occurrence in the population. All right, thank you. That's it. Do you want to ask questions or anything? Yes.
I missed the very beginning of the talk, so you might have said this, but how do you define creativity is such a broad topic and dyslexia is such a narrow topic?
I don't define it. I don't know what it is. It's being defined by the media as dyslexics are overrepresented as creative.
Yeah.
I can't, I'm sure you can define it, I'm sure you can measure it accurately, but I don't think we've done that yet.
Because once I heard, like years ago, I heard the late neurologist Norman Geschwin speaking, and he was talking about with dyslexics, there might be a biological reason for dyslexia because it allows other parts of the brain to develop, be more developed, which would be something like creativity with math, science, or music, he was saying.
It's a totally testable hypothesis, which I don't think has been tested and I think needs to be tested. There is, as far as I know, there is one study that has a small group of dyslexics compared to another small group of typically developing individuals. I think they were college age or adults, where the dyslexics outperform the typically developing subjects on a figure recognition task, which was called impossible figures, which obviously we don't see impossible figures very often because they're pretty hard to interpret, and I think if we saw impossible figures in life, we would be confused. But anyways, the dyslexics were equal in, the dyslexic population or sample was equal in their accuracy, but tended to be a bit quicker in terms of milliseconds, in terms of their responses. And this is said to be an indication that dyslexics process visual spatial information differently. That may be true. Does that relate to everyday experiences? I have no idea. So if somebody asked me, which comorbid model would you think is most likely, I would probably have an answer for that. Yes?
Which model?
I think probably the chance model is the one I'd put my money on right now, because we're talking about a comorbid model where we're talking about one end of the distribution, where you fall on one end of the distribution, causally putting you on another end of a distribution. That's a very interesting model to have happen, both neurologically and behaviorally. So I think that there have been tons of claims about different processing skills in dyslexics, and I think it's time that we start measuring these and trying to figure out whether scientifically they make sense, and also looking at them from a population standpoint to see whether we are talking about just a phenomenon that happens more at the individual or at the level of the population. Okay, I pretty much killed the enthusiasm in this room. So.
I'm sure Mark appreciated that.
He can raise the room back up from the dead.
I don't have slides, and I'm going to be brief. I want to thank Russell for inviting me. I got asked to do this. I want to tell you how terribly intimidated I am. I feel kind of like a guinea pig, and I don't consider myself exceptional, although I have a very successful career in engineering and education. I'm also dyslexic. I'm not quite sure how you guys define it. I came today and I've been listening to the presentations today. I'm absolutely fascinated, and I feel like I'm going to get poked and prodded. But so just to kind of give you my experience, when I was growing up back before dyslexia was defined, I was just a problem child. My parents would probably still agree with that. But I really just couldn't read. I was not good at reading, but I was good at math. And so this morning, this discussion about the difference between math and reading and the relationship, it was very fascinating to me because I was never good at adding, but we did multiplication tables as kids orally. We did not do them. We didn't look at them, which was fine for me because I couldn't read really. So that was an interesting thing. So I learned multiplication, and as an engineer, although I had a discussion in the hall about math, and the person I was discussing with might disagree, I'm actually pretty good at math, and was successful in an engineering career because of that. There's a few things that I would just like to throw out to you as questions and thoughts for you to think about. My background might be unique in that I did not grow up as a native English speaker. I grew up speaking Italian and French. So English was a second language. And I don't know if that's why I couldn't read or if it was different. I still have trouble reading. I don't like to read, and I don't read a lot for that reason. Nowadays I can listen to it and I don't have to read. Thank God for books on tape. But I don't know if that learning a foreign language before puberty, according to the studies that my husband has done in his master's, actually wires your brain differently than if you learn a second language after puberty. So I don't know if that had any effect on me. That would be an interesting thing to look at. Do people who have second languages before puberty, the brain study you did, I think it'd be fascinating to see how that would affect math and reading and if they're dyslexic. The other thing that I would think people need to look at, you seem to be very clear about dyslexia and when it is and when it isn't. But there's variation within that disability. I don't think I'm horribly dyslexic. In fact, the person that diagnosed me told my parents I was mildly dyslexic, whatever that means. The thing that, because dyslexia has a stigma associated with it, I wonder if there is a threshold beyond which, if you're below a certain threshold of dyslexia, so it's mild enough, does that stigma ruin your self-confidence so much that your interventions aren't going to help because I'm just sure I'm disabled? There's a self-confidence thing. And the thing that was hardest for me, because I was diagnosed a little bit later, I thought I was a competent student. I was doing okay. I was getting grades. So I couldn't read so well, so I struggled. I read more slowly. I had good friends who'd read to me. But when I was told I had a problem, that was really devastating to my belief that I could actually do what I wanted to do in life. So I think as you go through these kind of things as practicing professionals, the population stuff, I love this talk to understand the difference between the population and the individual. You deal with populations, you deal with set numbers, you deal with methodologies and all the wonderful tests, but you're dealing with individuals. And so as you do these studies, kind of keeping track of those two realities to the people that may have this disability, I think is going to be really important. The other thing is now, it's interesting for me because as a dean, I'm a dean of a small college, so I have a lot of interaction with my students. I cannot tell you the number of students that come to me who say they have ADHD and they're dyslexic. My major problem growing up, my last name's Tumeo, so Mark, and they called me Motor Mouth Mark because I never sat still and I never shut up. And when I was growing up, they just called me hyperactive so they didn't drug me. But it's the correlation between those two. I don't know if it's real or scientific, but boy, to me, it feels really real. So that's another area that I would encourage some looking at. And I think that there may be more than just correlation. I think there may be causal. I might not be able to read well because I never paid attention. I don't know. Or because I couldn't read, I didn't want to pay attention. I don't know. So those are the kind of things. I just want to thank you for, I really am deeply honored and terribly nervous about being the subject of what you're all working on. So I want to thank you for what you're doing. I'm way too late for whatever fixes or help or assistance. You know, I got 6 more years and I'm retired. But you know, for the kids that I deal with in my classes in my university, what you're doing could be very, very valuable. But I don't know what else to say other than thank you for what you're doing, and I wish you a whole bunch of success. Thank you.
Are there any final questions for the panel? Yes? Can you speak up? Or
I had a question for you.
for who?
For you.
Oh, me? I don't think this is in my contract for today.
We heard today about some really good research, and old and new, that's existed for a long time. And my question is, from your perspective at OSEP, do you foresee any grants coming down the pipe that would put into practice some of this research into a model pilot program for reading and dyslexia?
Well, we really can't discuss future investments publicly, certainly before it's made. You know, we have tried to do a cohort of model demonstration projects annually. We've been successful the last 3 or 4 years in doing that. We used to do $20 million a year in model demonstrations on a variety of topics, but that money no longer exists. So we're hoping in 2018 fiscal year to do some models, but we're not the researchers. You know, Joan is going to have to answer, you know, that question. We have a research authority to do model demonstrations in our technical assistance line and to do some research in technology. So thank you for the question. We would, I would also add that our funding has decreased annually under multiple administrations. So that is a challenge, as you all well know. So, yes.
Well, just since we've done any more questions. So, dyslexia and giftedness, and then dyslexic person that has successfully made himself a life that's honorable and wonderful, and what we would aspire for our children. I think it's important to recognize, whether there's a relationship or not, that there is a relationship between perceived reading disability and potential. So the important part about honoring the gift is that we can't forget that these kids that are at the low end of the bell curve in their reading, that's not necessarily who they are. They may disperse equally across the belt. But unless we celebrate those successes and more people come out and talk about their struggles, well, now the mindset needs to change in the general education classroom that our kids that struggle to read can be successful in many, many areas, and we can foster that. So that's kind of where I see the hype around the successful dyslexics. Our children and our teachers and our society needs to look beyond the weakness. So.
Yeah, I hope that I wasn't giving you the impression that that's what I was doing. I was just trying to talk about population versus individual. And it's not just creativity, it's all the distributions that make up a life, right? And so we probably all fit along that, and none of those should, or very few of those distributions should be defined by your reading skill, okay? So one of the things that's interesting in my class is many of the videos that we watch have individuals who have become successful, and there's a couple common themes. They all talk about how the school years were the most difficult times in their lives, okay? And that, I think, is a common theme for dyslexics. The way we set up school is, for most of them, is not easy. It's a struggle. The other is, at some point in time, every one of them was told that they would not succeed, okay? And for all of these, it was sort of like that chip on their shoulder. And the thing that I do kind of resonate with Gladwell on is he's not talking about so much being born with some potential. What he says is it's the struggle that causes these people to be exceptional. And that's one thing we don't really think about is what's the effect of the struggle, okay? And does the struggle, in certain ways, propel us to do other things and do them exceptionally? I don't know, but I agree with you. We need to celebrate all of our successes, right? And so, but the message that all dyslexics will be Richard Branson is a dangerous one. It is I would like to be Richard Branson, to tell you the truth. He seems to live a pretty darn good life. We also, and I work in a lot of schools. I was a teacher. A lot of the kids that I worked with, they were grinding it out, you know, and you're right. Every day you have to pump them up. And so I don't want my message, my scientific message, to be thought of as an inhumane way of looking at the population and the individual. But I do have a hard time with a scientific hypothesis that being at the lower, selected at the lower end of the distribution in reading is associated above chance with being exceptional. And so I want to test that scientifically. The hypothesis has been presented to the public. It needs to be tested. And it doesn't need to be tested by the public because the public, 68% of the public thinks dyslexia is reading letters backwards, okay? And what happens is, through the media is testing it for us, and they're presenting the data, and the data's not right, okay? And so, you know, the question is, do we have the will, do we have the funds to actually test this to better understand whether there is something to Galaberta's suggestion that some kind of neuromigration early on causes some type of exceptionalities. It is an empirical question. It has not been thoroughly addressed. It's barely been addressed. So I've taught kids who have dyslexia. I do research on kids who have dyslexia. I want the best for dyslexics. I also want people to understand what dyslexia is and to better quantify what it is outside of the reading areas that either make these kids special or different or the same as us. So,
Based on the highly scientific sample of one that I am, for me, it's the struggle. The only reason I got to where I got is because many people told me I couldn't, and I carry that through. That's you said a chip. It is a chip on my shoulder. When someone tells me that I can't do something, that's when I'm going to do everything I can to prove them wrong or right, whichever way it comes out. But man, does that tick me off.
he's going to give a TED Talk here. I'm going to be fighting that one too. I'll be crying. Oh, my students cry when they watch those TED Talks, and then I say, oh, by the way, scientifically, and they're like, oh, yeah.
Well, if you'll join me in thanking the panel again, and I'll turn it over to Russell.